Could I interrupt because my time is limited, unfortunately. You just said that this is, that 10 years ago you wouldn't have agreed to a regime change. However, in 1998, you as a member of the New American Century sent a letter to President Clinton.
I said something different.
Well, no, wait a sec. You were saying we're seeing it in the light of September 11th. That's just not true. You've been advocating for regime change all through the late 90s. And in this letter,
can I explain? There's a very clear
strategy should aim, above all, this is 1998, the strategy should aim, above all, at the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime from power. You signed that letter.
Senator, there's a very big difference. I was very clear. I don't know if it's in that letter, but elsewhere, I never thought before September 11th that we should use tens of thousands of American troops to do the job for the Iraqis. I never thought we should go to Baghdad, even at the end of the Gulf War, when I thought we should have done some other things we didn't do. I thought up until September 11th that our job was to help the Iraqi people. I think the mistake we made in 1991 was they rose up against Saddam and they got no help from us. September 11th changed the stakes, in my view, for the United States and made it a different matter in terms of using American troops. The end is the same, but you're not distinguishing the means, and the means are absolutely crucial. Putting American troops' lives at stake is something that we do when our security is threatened. Our security was threatened. The troops out there, I think, understand that it is threatened. I think they understand that they're part of fighting the war on terrorism as we go on today, and that is important. And by the way, I agree with you, Charles Taylor is a monster, and we are trying with the United Nations and with the West African states to get a plan together that will get him out of Liberia. We also need to do it in a way that doesn't bring on yet another kind of slaughter, because the people going after Charles Taylor may not be an awful lot better than he is, and that's part of our problem there.
Well, I'll just finish up by saying I really resent when witnesses talk that this is in the light of September 11th, when the evidence is to the contrary.
Senator, you're misrepresenting what I said in that letter.
You have over and over again, through the late 90s, urged regime change in Iraq.
Can I try again then, since I believe you're not representing my views properly? It is true. I thought from the end of the Gulf War up until September 11th of 2001 that it was important for the United States to help Iraqis get rid of that regime, and that is a policy of regime change. But I did not believe that it was either necessary or justified to use large-scale American military forces to do that job. At the end of the Gulf War, all it would have taken was a minimum application of U.S. air power and some of the artillery that were sitting on the south bank of the Euphrates River. September 11th changed the stakes for us, in my view, dramatically, and it changed the whole way of looking at an uncertain but still disturbing threat of the combination of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism.
Paul Wolfowitz was born in Ithaca, New York, where his father, Jacob Wolfowitz, was teaching at Cornell University. He yearned to follow in the footsteps of his father, but not in the field of statistical theory. Instead, he grew up learning about worldviews and foreign affairs. He would later enroll at the University of Chicago, where he would earn a bachelor's in political science while being influenced by a professor whose conservative views met his own. Albert Wohlstetter was a political science teacher who also headed the dissertation committee of Paul Wolfowitz in 1965. Wohlstetter gathered a cadre of fiery young intellectuals around him, many of whom are working and associating with the magazine publisher Irving Kristol, in which the group included Richard Perle, Zalmay Khalilzad, and the young Wolfowitz. Wohlstetter himself, a protege of the Machiavellian academic Leo Strauss, is often considered the intellectual godfather of modern neoconservatism. Here, Wolfowitz would meet with two future neoconservatives who would later have a major influence in world politics, Richard Perle and William Kristol. Wohlstetter would send two of his young proteges, Perle and Wolfowitz, to work on the staff of Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, a conservative Democrat out of Washington. Jackson was no ordinary Democrat, however. He was a strict conservative hawk committed to working on behalf of the U.S. defense industry. Jackson assembled a staff of bright, young, ideological, homogeneous staffers who would later become some of the most influential and powerful neoconservatives of their time, and they included Perle, Douglas Feith, Elliot Abrams, Abraham Shulsky, and of course, Paul Wolfowitz. Wolfowitz, now with the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, is investigated for giving classified documents on the proposed sale of U.S. weapons to an Arab government to an Israeli government official through the auspices of an official with the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. An inquiry is launched but later dropped, and Wolfowitz will continue with the ACDA through 1980. And a visiting professor at the Paul Nitschke School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Shortly thereafter, he joined the Republican Party. Following the 1980 election of President Ronald Reagan, the new National Security Advisor, Richard Allen, formed the administration's foreign policy advisory team. Allen initially rejected Wolfowitz's appointment, but following discussions instigated by former colleague John Lehman, Allen offered Wolfowitz the position of Director of Policy Planning at the Department of State. Here, Wolfowitz would gain intimate knowledge of Middle East policy making under rising State Department officials such as Donald Rumsfeld and John Lehman. He would hire fellow neoconservative academic Michael Ledeen as a special advisor. Reagan would be heavily influenced by the Kirkpatrick Doctrine pertaining to the Middle East, named after Gene Kirkpatrick, who was an influential political science, from the article Dictatorships and Dictators. Quote, although most governments in the world are, as they always have been, autocracies of one kind or another, no idea hold greater sway in the mind of educated Americans than the belief that it is possible to democratize governments anytime, anywhere, under any circumstances. But decades, if not centuries, are normally required for people to acquire the necessary disciplines and habits, end quote. Wolfowitz, however, broke from this official line by denouncing Saddam Hussein of Iraq at a time when Donald Rumsfeld was offering the dictator support in his conflict with Iran. Other areas where Wolfowitz disagreed with the administration was in his opposition to attempts to open up dialogue with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, and to the sale of airborne warning and control systems, or AWACS, aircraft to Saudi Arabia. Wolfowitz demonstrated himself to be one of the strongest supporters of Israel in the Reagan administration, when most were preoccupied with the sale and arming of the Afghan Mujahideen during the 1979 Afghan-Soviet War. On March 30th, 1982, the New York Times predicted that Paul Wolfowitz, the Director of Policy Planning, will be replaced because Alexander Haig found Mr. Wolfowitz too theoretical. Instead, on June 25th, 1982, George Shultz replaced Haig as the Secretary of State, and Wolfowitz was promoted. In 1989, changes were rapidly seen inside the State Department as future neoconservative Dick Cheney became Defense Secretary. He brings into the Pentagon a core group of young ideological staffers with largely academic, not military backgrounds. Many of these staffers are neoconservatives who once congregated around Henry Scoop Jackson. Cheney places them in the Pentagon's Policy Directorate under the supervision of Undersecretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, himself one of Jackson's cadre. While most administrations lead the Policy Directorate to perform mundane tasks, Wolfowitz and his team had no interest in such. Instead, they focused on geostrategic issues. One of his Pentagon aides will later recall, they consider themselves conceptual. Wolfowitz and his team are more than willing to reevaluate the most fundamental precepts of U.S. foreign policy in their own terms. And in Cheney, they have what reporters Franklin Foer and Spencer Ackerman call a like-minded patron. This would set the stage in the years to come for the Middle East regional predominance and, of course, military strategic value of the United States. Wolfowitz and Cheney were on similar wavelengths when it came to U.S. foreign policy and Middle East affairs, as both were staunch proponents of the neoconservative ideology and for Israeli politics, especially the Likud Party, which was headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. From 1989 to 1993, Wolfowitz serves in the administration of President George H.W. Bush as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, under then U.S. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. But in 1991, after the Persian Gulf War, Wolfowitz and his then assistant Scooter Libby wrote the Defense Planning Guidance of 1992, which came to be known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It would be leaked to the New York Times, and the public was outraged. The document was widely criticized as imperialist, as the document outlined a policy of unilateralism and preemptive military action to suppress potential threats from other nations and prevent any other nation from rising to superpower status. Years later, a new policy amendment would arise from the neoconservative think tank. This time, it would be led by William Kristol, who was very known to Wolfowitz from his years at the University of Chicago. 1997 would give rise to the new think tank, which would have prominent neocons called the Project for the New American Century, or PNAC. Founded by Kristol and Robert Kagan, it would promote global American and political military leadership. The organization stated that American leadership is good both for America and for the world, and sought to build support for a Reaganite policy of military strength and moral clarity. The number of figures associated with PNAC that have been members of the Reagan or the Bush administration, and the number that would take up office with the administration of the second President Bush, demonstrated that it was not merely a question of employees and budgets. It described the United States as the world's preeminent power and said that the nation faced a challenge to shape a new century favorable to American principles and interests. In order to achieve this goal, the statement's co-signers called for significant increases in defense spending and for the promotion of political and economic freedom abroad. And in 1998, the PNAC leadership would pen a letter to then U.S. President Bill Clinton about entering a war with Iraq. Persuasion would be held under the threat Saddam Hussein poses to the region's oil supply and to Saudi interests. But not everything is as it seems. The PNAC's first public act was to release a statement of principles. On June 3rd, 1997, it described the United States as the world's preeminent power and said that the nation faced a challenge to shape a new century favorable to American principles and interests. The PNAC signers and its petitions to the Clinton administration proved instrumental in prompting Operation Desert Fox, although the Clinton doctrines concluding iteration of what would become a national security strategy proved pivotal as well. The social welfare associated with neoconservative ideas has been critiqued as a revival of social imperialism, particularly in the context of overseas assets, security interests, oil technologies, and the doctrine of preemption. The letter is signed by many who would later lead the 2003 Iraq War. 10 of the 18 signatories would later join the Bush administration, including Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, Roger Zolik, Undersecretaries of State John Bolton, Paula Dobransky, Zalmay Khalilzad, Richard Pearl, William Bennett, William Kristol, Robert Kagan, and James Woolsey. Clinton was hesitant to follow through, and on December 19, 1998, he would be impeached. Between the years 2001 to 2005, during the George W. Bush administration, Wolfowitz served as the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, reporting to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. It was here Wolfowitz and the neoconservatives will hold the most influence than at any other period. Using the book published by Laurie Malroy, Study of Revenge, Saddam Hussein's Unfinished War Against America, to place blame on Saddam's Iraqi regime for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and influence the Bush administration to enter a war with Iraq. In Malroy's acknowledgments, she thanks John Bolton, Lewis Libby, and Wolfowitz for their support and help in writing the book. The new transition team of neoconservatives are also taking their place under the newly elected Bush administration. This abject idealism, enthusiastically supported by the staunch Bush neocons, was defined by Jonathan Clark, a libertarian based at the Cato Institute in 2004, as unique to conservatism and rather dangerous. Clark categorized the neocons as follows. 1, a belief deriving from religious conviction that the human condition is defined as a choice between good and evil, and that the true measure of political character is to be found in the willingness by the former to confront the latter. 2, an assertion that the fundamental detriment of the relationship between states rests on military power and the willingness to use it. 3, a primary focus on the Middle East and global Islam as the principal theater for American overseas interests. American economist Paul Krugman criticized the neoconservatives for causing a war unrelated to the 9/11 attacks and fought for the wrong reasons. However, Richard Armitage would eventually become the Deputy Secretary of State, along with Paul Wolfowitz. Elliot Abrams will join the National Security Council. Zalmay Khalilzad, Douglas Feith, and Abraham Solsky will join the Defense Department, while Richard Perle will head the Defense Policy Board, an independent group that advised the Pentagon. Meanwhile, the push for the Iraq War from the neoconservative think tank, the PNAC, continued as published letters to major media outlets and White House daily briefs. Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz and Undersecretary of Defense and Policy Douglas Feith set up a secret intelligence unit named the Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, sometimes called the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, to sift through raw intelligence reports and look for evidence of a link between Iraq and al-Qaeda. Defending the project, Paul Wolfowitz will later tell the New York Times that the team's purpose is to circumvent the problem in intelligence work that people who are pursuing a certain hypothesis will see certain facts that others don't, and not see other facts that others will. He insists that the Special Pentagon Unit is not making independent intelligence assessments. This would turn out to be false. On September 11th, 2001, the nation under attack from al-Qaeda hijacked planes led to the World Trade Center towers to their fall and destruction, while the Pentagon suffers a major attack. This would be the new Pearl Harbor styled attack that the members of the PNAC document had described just 2 years prior. It would also lead the neocons to the war that they have wanted since 1997. Deputy of Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz and Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feith argue in 3 memos why Iraq should be included as a target in the war on terrorism. One memo, Were We Asleep, is dated September 18, 2001, and suggests links between Iraq and al-Qaeda. Paul Wolfowitz arranges for Christopher DeMuth, president of the neoconservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, to create a group to strategize about the war on terrorism. In the first emergency meeting of the National Security Council on the day of the attacks, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld asked, why shouldn't we go against Iraq, not just al-Qaeda? With Wolfowitz adding that Iraq was a brittle, oppressive regime that might break easily. It was doable. And from that moment on, Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz used every available opportunity to press the case. In the Office of Special Plans, a Pentagon unit created by Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz held secret meetings about opening up a second front against Saddam, where Secretary of State Colin Powell was excluded. Austere independent investigative reporter Seymour Hersh would later say of the Office of Special Plans, quote, the office was created in order to find evidence of what Wolfowitz and his boss, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, wanted to be true, that Saddam Hussein had close ties to al-Qaeda, and that Iraq had an enormous arsenal of chemical, biological, and possibly even nuclear weapons that threatened the region and potentially the United States. The CIA was out to disprove linkage between Iraq and terrorism, end quote. However, the CIA would later falsify information which would assert the policy planning headed under Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith. The group came to a quick agreement after just 2 days of discussions, and a report is made from their conclusions. They agree it will take 2 generations for the United States to defeat radical Islam. Egypt and Saudi Arabia are the keys to the problems of the Middle East, but the problems there are too intractable. Iran is similarly difficult, but Iraq is weak and vulnerable. DeMuth would later comment, we concluded that a confrontation with Osama bin Laden was inevitable. He was a gathering threat, that most menacing, active, and unavoidable threat. We agreed that Saddam would have to leave the scene before the problem would be addressed. The office's staff members presumably developed defense policies aimed at building an international coalition, prepare the Secretary of Defense and his top deputies for interagency meetings, coordinate troop deployment orders, craft policies for dealing with prisoners of war and illegal combatants, post-war assistance, and reconstruction policy planning, post-war governance, Iraqi oil infrastructure policy, post-war Iraqi property disputes, war crimes and atrocities, war plan review, and in their spare time, prepare congressional testimony for their principles. Bush began formally making the case to the international community for an invasion of Iraq in his September 12, 2002 address to the United Nations Council. And then, on October 16, 2002, the United States Congress jointly enacted authorization for use of military force against Iraq Resolution of 2002, which was also called the Iraq Resolution. The Iraq War would commence on March 20th, 2003, with an invasion into the city's capital, Baghdad. In a 2003 report by the British publication The Guardian, the Office of Special Plans had a foreign asset involved in the reshaping of the Middle East. That asset was Israel. Quote, the Office of Special Plans was an open and largely unfiltered conduit to the White House, not only for the Iraqi opposition. It also forged close ties to a parallel ad hoc intelligence operation inside Ariel Sharon's office in Israel, specifically to bypass Mossad and provide the Bush administration with more alarmist reports on Saddam's Iraq than Mossad was prepared to authorize. None of the Israelis who came were cleared into the Pentagon through normal channels, said one source familiar with the visits. Instead, they were waved in on Mr. Fite's authority without having to fill in the usual forms. The exchange of information continued a long-standing relationship with Mr. Fite and other Washington neoconservatives had with the Israelis' Likud Party, end quote. Allegations have also been made that Pentagon employees in the Fite office have also been involved in plans for overthrowing the governments of Iran and Syria. These policies were also echoed by a decades-old Israeli document entitled the Oded Yanon Plan. The plan was to analyze the weaknesses of Arab countries by citing what he perceived to be flaws in their national and social structures, concluding that Israel should aim to bring about the fragmentation of the Arab world into a mosaic of ethnic and confessional groupings. Although this has been labeled as conspiracy talk, some of his specific outlines have been fulfilled. Years later, in 2005, Paul Wolfowitz would become president of the World Bank, appointed by none other than George W. Bush. He would also become part of a steering committee at the Bilderberg Group. Today, Paul Wolfowitz can be seen doing interviews with the New York Times, MSNBC, Washington Post about foreign policy and critiquing the Democratic base. He is still active in American politics and often advises for the Republican Party. However, Wolfowitz's own policies helped to aid in the needless slaughter of over 1.5 million Iraqis during a 10-year period. His strict neoconservative views would help fundamentally shape U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, which would ultimately aid in the killing of over another million in countries such as Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and the Sudan. His crimes should never be forgotten nor forgiven.